Idioms. These idioms are connected with numbers. Quite a lot of idioms in English connected with numbers. First one. There's nought as queer as folk.
The artist now known as Chris, and formerly as Christine and the Queens, described her coming out as pansexual in France as a detonation. Laetitia is one of, if not the, first person to come out as pansexual in France, a country which has had its own high-profile problems with homophobia.
La colère de Dieu va s'abattre sur la France.
How the French public were prepared to understand sexuality did not include the ambiguity she was offering. While the lesbian, gay and bisexual labels are understood and at least broadly accepted, other, more niche labels require public interrogation. Said Laetitia, when your sexuality is not the norm, you have to find words to express it. So what words can we use to describe such a nebulous and subjective concept? Most people do not experience their sexualities through dictionary definitions. If not straight, the typical acronym, LGBT+, covers most bases, though that plus there is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Queer can be used then as an umbrella term, an easier word to say and, according to some, a more inclusive label. As the LGBT plus QIAAP acronym grows longer and longer, it becomes more unwieldy, and it also becomes more exclusive. Whereas the 4 letters and that all-important plus implied a wide net, the more specific the acronym becomes, the more people whose specific identities are left out of it. In theory, the idea that one word could be used instead isn't such a bad one. The history of the term is obviously checkered. Originating as a term meaning strange or unusual, it had as much of a negative connotation as synonyms for strange or unusual generally have, which is to say, it wasn't not there. It was co-opted by the homophobic set in the late 19th century, with one of the earliest uses of the word in this context being found in a letter from 1894. In the 30s and 40s, the hetero-homo binary began to coalesce, followed closely by the emergence of the gay identity in the 60s and 70s. Gay was an identity that asserted itself against the demands for silence and invisibility. Ironically, many of the men who identified as queer at this time were claiming that they were, in essence, the same as other men, and expressed their desire to assimilate. By the end of the 1980s, however, this was flipped on its head, with HIV/AIDS activists such as Queer Nation rejecting the assimilationist goals of the more conservative gay campaigners. But it's a very complicated thing. People are often critical of queer being used as an umbrella term due to the homophobic abuse they've suffered, and this is totally fair, although personally I don't experience queer being thrown around as a slur these days as much as I do other words. But in the 40s and earlier, men who identified as queer would without doubt have been met with their own identities thrown at them as a slur. This is a way of being denied personhood, being forced into, as Judith Butler might put it, zones of abjection. Even still, these men, having left the more pathologizing terms from the medical community, such as invert or deviant, behind them, continued to use the term queer to describe themselves. In his book, The Culture of Queers, Richard Dyer, the writer and cultural theorist, lays out the subculture in which queer men lived. The rituals and traditions that they both created and perpetuated make up some of the foundations of the communities we live in today. To claim that queer is a slur and nothing else is surely another way of relegating these lives to the margins in their own communities. Not to say that all these men embraced and celebrated the label, it's an awful lot more ambiguous than that, but it isn't as easy as saying that the word was bad and hurtful and should never be used again. So obviously this is a highly truncated history, but we can counter some contemporary claims against the usage of the word queer here. We can see that it's not a fad and it's not a new thing. Or perhaps it is a new thing, but relatively. It's certainly older than terms such as gay. Its new, more radical usage is actually more than 30 years old, which is a really long time in terms of words used as self-identifiers. Unless you're talking about the word lesbian, which has endured throughout multiple centuries, although it has had different meanings and sometimes was even applied to men, which is crazy. art academic and critical theorist Eve Kosofsky Sedgewick gave a definition of what she believed queer to mean in her book Tendencies, published in 1993. In it, she wrote that queer was what was across genders, across sexualities, across genres, across perversions, and the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. Kosofsky Sedgewick was a pioneer in the academic field of queer theory, an area which sometimes draws controversy from those unfamiliar with it. It's not just about queering things, or worse, analysing how other people queer things, though I am guilty of the latter myself, but also about interrogating the gaps in fields such as philosophy and history. What do identities do? What do they mean? How do you become? What is queer knowledge? What was queer knowledge? What are bodies? What were bodies? And what does it mean to be bodied? These questions and many more can be answered, but only if you can fight your way through hundreds of pages of unbearably dense text. An interesting case of the world outside the university library encountering queer theory can be found in the reaction to Daggett article Drone Disorientations. Published in the academic journal International Feminist Politics in 2014 and winning some awards, the article was controversial on sites such as Reddit and Twitter, where it was mostly ridiculed for its subtitle. However, the idea behind the article wasn't such a bad one. How do traditional masculine perceptions of war change when the soldiers, who are used to physically being not only away from home but also at the site of their destruction, are now at home, killing from a distance? How does this affect masculinity and thus the soldiers' actions? If perceived emasculation is leading to soldiers exaggerating the violence they inflict as a compensation, then this is surely an extremely important question to ask. However, the article also met pushback from queer theorists and writers such as Josie Sparrow, who pointed out the imperialist and racist overtones of the article, as well as where Daggett had gone too far with her utilisation of queer language. The clash between Daggett's terminology and those who accused her of writing nonsense points to a greater conflict over the academic co-option of the word. On the one hand, people feel annoyed at the instrumentalisation, we'll go with that, pronunciation of that, of their identity into dry academic language. This is especially as it's seemingly being used to glorify drones and other things that are decidedly not queer as anyone in their daily life understands it. On the other hand, the queer theorists had to fight pretty hard in the 80s and 90s to make their perspective heard. They ended up upending the concept of necessary heterosexist binaries and found a new, more complicated place to start analysing the world around them. The idea that queer means questioning what lies in between the gaps of the old style you are or you aren't binaries has led to new ideas in art, history and philosophy. All of these have the potential to change the way people think about their lived experiences, and that is not useless or ridiculous. So who is queer then? Who would choose to identify as a knowledge category or a genre of politics? Information in this section mainly comes from the USA, from a survey which itself mentions that similar, though less intensive, surveys from Australia have slightly different results. People who identify as non-binary or genderqueer top the list of people who identify as queer, followed by women and then men. People who describe themselves as queer are more likely to experience attraction to more than one gender, and are more likely to have been in relationships with trans people. Men who identify as queer are much more likely to be in a relationship with a trans person. They are also more likely to be younger than people who identify with the more traditional LGBT labels. Now would be a good time to point out the hegemony of Western thought and concepts in the global queer community and how they can clash with traditional understandings of gender and sexuality. And I'm using all of these terms with the caveat that they are culturally and historically contingent. Right now they mean one thing, in 100 years they'll mean a different thing, and it's all relative. Queer may not be the best way to describe someone who is part of a traditional third gender culture in Indonesia, India, or in Native American communities, for example. In addition, waves of reactionary sentiment against America and other imperialistic forces have manifested in anti-queer sentiments. This is happening right now in Egypt, and it happened in Iran post-revolution. They still have the death penalty on their books for homosexual actions, and it is partly because of globalisation. But globalisation has also had a positive effect on queer communities. For example, the struggles of LGBT plus people in the US have acted as a roadmap in other countries, including Ireland. For more on this, check out Mark Gevisser's article in The Guardian. Globalisation and queerness interact in other ways as well. The great neoliberal consuming machine, desperate to sell all things to all people, has profited enormously from the desire for radical visibility. Pennies, or Primark if you're foreign, sells a wide variety of LGBT plus merch during Pride Month for incredibly low prices. They profit off slave labour, particularly off the slave labour of women and children. This isn't a new observation, which is damnation in itself. However, the neoliberal queer aesthetic, outwardly radical, wearing dresses to red carpets without doing anything concrete to further the cause of those who would wear dresses to the local nightclub, retweeting urges to vote for Biden in 2020, favourably comparing evil bastard Ronald Reagan to anyone at all or anything at all.
Communism?
Communism. I think communism is...
Careful, we're in America.
Exactly. I think communism is misunderstood.
I think we should do the next question.
Let's just do the next question.
Coming out as genderqueer in partnerships with a brand, which is literally coming out as SponCon, strutting your stuff in a plastic, saccharine and safe Taylor Swift music video. Is this what queerness is now? But then compare and contrast that with the speech that Billy Porter gave at the 2017 GLAAD Awards, and you might begin to see the differences.
But, that's what I want to say to you and tell you all tonight. You are all enough. We are all enough. Fuck them. Because now is the time to speak up. Because the attack from this administration on the arts and on LGBTQ and other marginalized people is real. And it is meant, once again, to silence us. However, since the beginning of time, artists are the folks who engage critical thinking and encourage those who think they are powerless to question the status quo, speak truth to power, change hearts and minds.
The Queer Eye Tory gaze praised Sean Spicer.
Actually, no, let me tell you something. Sean Spicer and I have been talking. Yeah, literally, I was most excited to meet him because, the thing is that people would look at us and think that we're polar opposites, but I'm a big believer that if you can talk to someone and meet in the middle, you can learn about each other and help each other both grow. And so we have been chatting all day today. He's a good guy, really sweet guy. Yeah,
Have we sacrificed radical queerness to finally assimilate into the rest of the world? And if we have, at what price to ourselves? The pride parades that are half Google employees and half Murdoch-owned media floats, despite what Murdoch has done to our community over the years, are littered with Amnesty International and queer communist groups desperately trying to raise awareness for the crimes being committed against our people under our very eyes in this very country, as glitter beards and drag queens are looked on fondly by those outside the alcohol-free Merrion Square setup as a kind of "it takes all sorts, aren't we great" diversity push. It doesn't seem, somehow, like the ideals of Queer Nation or the campy old queens who develop the language you use are being upheld. Eloise Letizier caused a frisson of controversy again last year, although in Le Monde Anglo-Saxon, when she lamented the same phenomenon. If the dominant society uses it, as in queerness, to sell shit, then we have lost the meaning of it. 10 queer artists to watch out for. How can you simplify it like that? Queer is about intense questioning that can't be made nice and glossy. As Judith Butler says, when identities become their own politics, is that not a sign of despair? Butler says that we should try and create categories that are made to account for what they exclude. In my opinion, queer is the best label we have for accounting what is excluded. But it's not perfect. Nothing is, I suppose.